Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. This has been created for those of us that love radical women who live perhaps by the rules, but also question and challenge the status quo. We want more from our lives, to enjoy our sexuality, to explore radical thought, and to celebrate women who have lived and continue to live unconventional lives. Hi, I'm Dr. Tony Baer, sexologist, educator, activist, and definitely a radical woman. Thank you for joining me as I share stories of women challenging the status quo and living life to the fullest. Join me as we unapologetically march to the beat of a different drummer together. Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. Today we have Susan Calvin here with us. She is the author of Changeling, an unremarkable story of my remarkable life. Susan, thank you so much for coming here today. Can you tell me why you wrote this book? What is this book about?
This is the story of my life and my experiences of transitioning from male to female. And I wrote the book to help other people that are coming up behind me, try to give them the benefit of my life experience.
Fantastic. Well, you know, the name of this podcast is Radical Rhythm. It's about women with radical ideas and radical lives.
I knew at a very early age I should have been female, but there wasn't anything that could be done about it when I was a child. And it was an incident that occurred while I was still flying for the Army that brought everything to a head and caused me to pursue the sex reassignment surgery.
So you were born what year?
1947.
Okay. And you described knowing that you were female from the earliest of ages.
Where I was just getting ready to go outside and play in the backyard, and as I reached to open the door to go out in the backyard, it hit me just as I said in the book. It's kind of like a bolt out of the blue or like an exploding star that I was supposed to be a girl.
Wow.
Of course, at that time, I realized that there really wasn't anything that could be done about it, surgically especially. So I just kind of kept it to myself for a lot of years. And I tried to do a couple of things that I recommend against. I made the mistake of thinking that if I got married, that feeling and that need would go away, and it didn't. And then I thought, well, if I join the military, maybe they could make a man out of me, and they don't. And so it just, like I said, I kind of kept it to myself until that one incident where I saw an interview on a TV show of a young lady that had already gone through the process. And what shocked me was that she was essentially telling my life story, and I'd never met her.
Wow.
And of course, that kind of let the cat out of the bag. And from that point on, I knew what I had to do, and there just was no going back.
Right. So your childhood was in the 50s. When did you
Correct.
see this television show?
Oh, gosh. That would have been sometime in the late 70s, maybe it would have been the late 70s.
Okay. So up to that point, you knew that you were female, but you were looking for, you said that the military would make a man out of you.
Yeah, and they don't. If you are a man, they'll make a better man out of you, but they won't take a woman and make a man out of her, or vice versa. And that's not their job. They have other issues or other motivations. So I basically kept everything to myself and hoped that those two things would cure me. But then I found out that, there really is no cure.
Right. So your military service was in Vietnam. You did 2 tours in Vietnam?
2 tours as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam.
Tell us a little bit about being a helicopter pilot in Vietnam.
Well, I went through flight school, and immediately after flight school, I joined a unit, the 3rd Squadron of the 17th Air Cav, we formed up and went to Vietnam as a unit.
The other day, you said something to me, Susan, about dreaming and dreaming about being a pilot in Vietnam, but in your
Hmm.
dreams, you had transitioned. Can you tell us a little bit more about those dreams and why you
I,
think you see yourself as a female in the dream?
I've only had two or three such dreams, but in each case, uh, I was in a helicopter in Vietnam, and I identified as female. I'm female in my dreams. I can't explain it. It's just something that happens.
What was it like being a helicopter pilot? Can you tell me a story of what a typical day was like?
Well, it kind of depends on the mission I was flying. As I mentioned, I started out as a gunship pilot, and oh gosh, I've got so many war stories it would take all day to tell them. Um, well, probably one of the most significant missions I flew was during the Tet Offensive. Everybody's heard about that. That kept everybody busy, and that was where I got my Distinguished Flying Cross because of the missions I flew that night.
And you were evacuating folks.
Well, actually, at that point, I was a gunship pilot, so I was out there shooting people and breaking things. And I just happened to think of something, and I did mention it in my book. Probably the most significant mission I flew over there was as a gunship pilot one night when we were trying to defend a night defensive position, and we were trying to dodge illumination flares and make gun runs. And toward the end of that mission, I remember looking down on the ground and seeing what looked like a lot of little black dots, or what you might describe as somebody having shaking pepper shaker all over the place.
Hmm.
And I asked the guy I was flying with, who was a little more experienced than I was. He said, "No, those are dead Viet Cong." And that's when it hit me. During that mission, I had just killed several hundred people, and uh, that was quite a shock to me.
Yeah.
And it wasn't long after that I had to quit flying gunships. I'd lost my edge. I couldn't do it anymore.
And then you went to being part of an ambulance crew.
Oh, well, I ended up flying what we called slicks for about a month toward the end of my first tour. And then I came back to Fort Knox for a couple of years and then went back to Vietnam. And the first 6 months of my second tour, I flew support for the regimental staff of the 11th Armored Cav Regiment. And then the last half of my second tour, I flew a mission called Dust Off, which was a medical evacuation helicopter.
Hmm.
And that was a job I really, really loved because I felt like I was doing something positive and constructive then. And I would do that job again in a heartbeat if somebody would just hand me the keys to a Huey.
Right. And the dreams that you have, are you a gunship um,
As a
person?
matter of fact, yeah, during those dreams, they tend to be more toward flying gunships.
Hmm.
But like I say, in each case, and there's only been two or three such dreams, but in each of those cases, I was female in the dream. I wish I could explain it. I don't know how I could, but I don't know
Right.
if anybody could. It's just something that happens.
And you volunteered for a second tour?
I volunteered to join the army. Yeah.
Right. At
Um,
that time, not many people can say that, right? Most of what we see in the media are folks that were drafted. Why did you want to be in the Army at that time?
well, it was a matter of personal pride. The country was at war, and I didn't want to be drafted because if you're drafted, they tell you where you're going to go and what you're going to do. By volunteering, I got to choose what I wanted to do as a career, and I chose flight school.
And did you always want to fly? Did you always dream of flying?
Oh yeah, at an early age, I knew my dad was a pilot, a private pilot, but I wanted to be like him as much as I could, and so flying became a big part of my life.
And when you finished your second tour in Vietnam, um, my understanding is that you became a training school instructor for pilots.
Well, after my second tour, I was discharged from the Army, from active service, and I joined a reserve unit nearby here in Olathe, Kansas, and I flew both Hueys and Chinooks for that unit as a flight instructor. And then after a couple of years, I had the opportunity to explore other avenues. I was a flight instructor for Bell Helicopter in Iran for about a year, and then came back and got on as a flight instructor down at Fort Rucker at the Army Aviation Center. And that's where I ended my career until I retired.
Okay. So during this time, you have. Uh, uh, how did you meet, or um, you said that you had watched a television program and you realized that somebody was telling your life story. How
Uh-huh.
did you go from watching that TV program to starting to transition?
Well, it was quite a shock when I was watching the interview. Again, a really attractive young girl that had gone through the change, and her life was quite similar to my own. And as a result, I bought her book and did other research. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that um, I was transsexual, and that at that point there really was no option. I had to change, otherwise my life would have been very miserable.
Right. So, um, I'm thinking about the period of time, so the 1960s into the 70s, we have really strong into the 70s, the feminist movement. Did that shape your attitudes one way or the other, or did it affect you in any way?
And can you restate that question? I
Yeah, we
missed part of
have
it.
a sexual revolution going on in the 60s and 70s. First,
Okay.
with the women's movement, followed by the LGBTQ movement, although it wasn't called LGBTQ, which is part of the questioning that follows. But I'm wondering
Mm-hmm.
if the women's movement affected you one way or another. So I'm just wondering what your experience was before, during, and after transitioning with the women.
I really wasn't into the women's movement back then. Uh, I was dealing with my own issues and really didn't have time for much else.
Right. And the gay liberation movement going on at the same time.
Well, that
Not,
would have been a totally different subject.
yeah. That so what I was trying to um uh, find out in your story is if there were outside movements that were also influential in your ideology, your transitioning, whether it was um, outside support or actually discrimination from other groups.
Uh, I don't think I could say that. Those groups were very young at the time, and I was dealing with my own issues and really didn't have time to deal with theirs.
Right. So you said you were married. When did you get married, and how did transitioning um, become a part of the marriage, or a problem in the marriage, or not a problem? How did that go?
I was married in 1967. Um, Very nice girl. She's been a big help to me throughout this whole process. And again, that was one of those things I did to try to, and I'll use air quotes, try to cure myself of this need to be female. I thought that getting married would do that, and it didn't. Uh, and of course, after that interview, there was no turning back for me,
Hmm.
and eventually had to let her know about it. And we finally got divorced, although she still has remained a close friend. She just uh, she just wasn't quite capable of coming along with me,
Mm-hmm.
and I could understand that.
Right. So, in your book, you talk about your relationship with God. Can
Oh,
you
definitely.
talk about that a little bit?
Uh, Speaking for myself, there was no way I could have gone through this transition without God running interference for me. So I have a close relationship with God, and I'm very grateful for the opportunities He's given me and the roadblocks He's removed to help me make this transition and live successfully as a female.
So, in a previous conversation that we had, you talked about the workplace and not transitioning while you're in the military, but transitioning afterwards. Can you talk a little bit about workforce and transitioning and your experience?
Well, as you can imagine, the military is a very patriarchal society, and a lot of the guys had trouble with my transition. However, there were a few that stood by me, and I still had a lot of good friends. So it kind of went both ways. Some people dealt with it better than others.
Right.
And eventually, for a time, they grounded me until I got through the surgery and all that, and got cleared back to flight status. And then I flew for several years afterwards, after the surgery.
So you were a
I thought I
military
did all right.
contractor, right? You're a military contractor, and in the late 1970s, early 80s, it didn't affect you in the workplace. You were
Well,
accepted.
it was stressful. A lot of things had to be worked around, but I tried to make it easy for everybody around me as much as I could. And as I say, some people dealt with it better than others. I'll tell you one thing: you find out who your friends are. For the most part, the guys I flew with, we got along well.
Good, good. So, um, why did you write the book? What are the lessons from your life that you want to share with other people?
Well, first of all, I made my own mistakes. Like I said, getting married and joining the military, looking for a cure. I want to help people from making or keep them from making the mistakes that I did. And if other people can learn and benefit from my experiences, I'll be gratified.
And what is one lesson that you would like to tell someone who is transitioning or someone who loves someone who is transitioning?
Well, part of the reason for writing the book was to help friends and family of the person transitioning. I think that group has been largely left out of a lot of the writings. Uh, and, they come along with you too, whether they want to or not. And it's just as hard on them as it is on those of us who are transitioning. So, I'm hoping the book will help out the family and friends.
What would they get from reading your book? What's one lesson or one bit of advice that you would give?
I think a lot of times that the family and friends look at the transitioning person as though they're dying, that they're losing a loved one, and uh, they'll never get them back, and that's not the case. Granted, you're going to lose them uh, in one sense, but you'll be getting them back in another sense, and they'll be a better person for it.
And they're who they've always been. They've just expressing it outwardly to everyone else. Would that be accurate, or was there?
Well, it's kind of like losing a person to death and then having them resurrected. I mean, we do come back differently, but I think in general we come back as better people.
So how would you describe yourself, pre-transition, post-transition? How have you changed, or how have you become a better person because you have transitioned?
Well, prior to my transition, I didn't have a very high opinion of myself. I didn't like the way I was. I wasn't a very happy person. And that manifests itself in the way you deal with other people. Uh, After the surgery, I've never been happier. I like to think I'm a lot easier to get along with and a better person all the way around because I'm comfortable with myself now.
So I'm looking at the table of contents in your book, and there's a whole
Mm-hmm.
chapter on attitudes. Are those your attitude changes, or the people around you attitude
Both.
changes, or
It would address
society's
both,
attitudes changes? Right.
and that too. That too. But I think I probably concentrated more on my attitude.
So how would you say society has changed since your transition from the
Well, I think
1980s to the 2020s?
first of all, when I did my transition, it was a relatively new concept, and people were having to learn how to deal with it. Over the past 20 or 30 years, it's become so common that most people just kind of brush it off and ignore it, and they don't make such a big deal out of it. So it's easier now than it was 20 or 30 years ago.
And would you say that social media, the media, has been a large effect on societal attitudes during this time because it's more open?
Possibly.
The internet
One
and
incident, one incident that happened that might help clarify something is that I checked with my church world headquarters here after my transition, and I asked the church, what did they think about it? And they said, well, early on it had been a problem, but by then it had become so common that nobody even cared about it anymore. I was afraid I'd be rejected by my church, and it turned out that I wasn't.
right, I would think that a church would be less accepting of someone who is in a body that isn't authentically them, rather than you being authentically yourself.
Yeah, that's what I was afraid of, but the answer they gave me was very encouraging, very comforting. And like I said, their position was that there had been so many of us that nobody really cared anymore.
Mm-hmm.
When I
As an
told my neighbors, oh, go ahead.
Uh-huh. So when you were a military contractor and you were an instructor and folks saw you as a male, you didn't feel that when you transitioned to female that they had less respect for you because you're a female teaching them how to do the exact same things that you did as a male?
Uh, well, part of that situation was that once they put me back on flight status, I wasn't able to teach initial entry students anymore because they were afraid I might be a bad influence on them or make their lives a little more difficult. And flight school's difficult enough, so I wasn't teaching initial entry students anymore. But I was flying support missions, so at least I would interact with them over the radio,
Mm-hmm.
and it never became an issue.
Right.
I'm sure that the word got around all over post as to who I was, but uh, like
Did
I say
you
the
feel
closest I
any
ever got to most of them was the radio.
yeah, did you feel any sort of way because you were in writing a support mission after transitioning as opposed to training initial candidates before transitioning?
Well, I would have preferred to go back to teaching students, but I could understand that it might have made life harder for them, so I didn't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So the people I flew with were already pilots that had graduated, and I was flying support missions, for the training that was being conducted.
Um, Tell us, you know, the gay and liberation movement from the 60s and 70s has transitioned to add a lot of letters, LGBTQIA, etc. Do
Hmm.
you feel, as a trans woman, part of the LGBTQ movement, or is it something that you've never identified with and don't identify with today?
Well, about the only thing I really identify with is the transsexual group. Now, that's not to say that I don't have friends that are gay. I do. Well, again, my military background causes me to want to define my terms rather specifically. And a long time ago, somebody or something I read somewhere clarified it for me, whereas it was explained that gender is between your ears and sex is below the belt. Uh, One of them is, I guess you could say, spiritual or psychological, and that would be gender. That's the way you see yourself, and sex is the way your body is configured.
So, would you
So,
say that you've always seen yourself as a female?
yeah, ever since that incident when I was 6 years old, and I realized that I should have been born a girl. I've
So,
always seen myself as female. Mentioned yesterday, uh, since gender is something between your ears, it's mental. You can't really change that. Once it's set for life. Um, Sex can be changed surgically because that's the physical part of your makeup.
which leads me to my next question. Can you tell me a little bit about your transition process? I wrote down on my notes, it's both, mind and body. And
Hmm.
you've explained just now that your mind and psychology and spirit has always been female.
As a female, full time, for at least a year before anybody would consider you for surgery. It was something called a real life test to make sure that you could function as a female after the surgery. So I did get involved with a support group down in Florida that helped me make that transition and begin living full time as a female. And they helped me with some of the adjustments, like the makeup, the electrolysis, um, gestures, the way I carried myself, that sort of thing.
Uh, Do you think that sexuality changes when one transitions, or it's really not a factor at all?
Uh, I guess that's kind of an individual thing. Some people I've known have gotten married and carried on a normal sexual life with a partner. Um, some people, like myself, don't. As I mentioned yesterday, at least for me, one of the results of the surgery was that I lost all my sex drive. So, seeking a sexual partner was not ever a factor for me, and I've remained single ever since surgery.
And you've been single how long now, Susan?
Oh well, it's been what, 38 years.
Okay. And
Uh,
and we talked about this before, but I want to make sure that our audience hears again. Why do you think it's really important for folks to read your book, The Changeling?
well, I think some people, in fact, most people, could probably benefit from some of the mistakes I made and from some of the advice I've given in the book, is things to do, things to avoid. Um, Plus, I think it will help the families and friends of the person transitioning. Those are the people that are often left out of the equation, and they make the journey with us, like it or not. And it's just as tough on them as it is on the people going through the transition. So I was hoping to educate some people about that and kind of help them to make that journey with us.
And I see your book is available on Kindle. Can
Yes,
you get it any other way, or is that the only way at
uh,
this point?
you can get it through Barnes and Noble or Amazon.
Okay, fantastic.
Now, if you don't mind, there's one request I would make of people: if they buy the book,
Sure.
uh, if they will go back to the place where they bought it and at least rate it, maybe leave a comment, it would certainly help the distribution.
Well, fantastic. Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. And
Okay.
I look forward to future conversations. I thank you so much. And best of luck with your book.
Could I make one other request, and you can edit this out if you feel like it? And this is more of a
Okay.
personal thing with me.
Uh huh.
As I mentioned yesterday, the interview on TV that got this all started for me was with a young girl. Her name was Canary Khan,
Mm hmm.
and for whatever reason, I've tried to get a hold of her several times. I could never find her. All the letters I wrote to her came back undelivered. Um, I really, really would like to thank her for getting me started on this journey. And if anybody out there happens to know where she is or how I could get a hold of her or have her get a hold of me through my publisher, it would mean a lot to me if I could just thank her personally.
And her name again is?
Canary Conn, Conn.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I will make sure that makes the broadcast because I think it's very important for folks to hear that. I appreciate you listening. Drop a comment below. I love to read your comments about the episode.